Ayrton Senna had a really unusual throttle technique that simply doesn't make much sense. So what is the technique? Why did he do it? Would it work in today's modern F1? And could he possibly have been even faster? All of that coming up in today's video. So you may have read online that Senna had this really unusual technique where he would stamp on and off the throttle as he was exiting a corner. So first up, take a look at this footage from Senna at Monza where you can clearly hear this blipping of the accelerator as he's driving through the corner. You can clearly hear there that he's on and off the throttle rapidly and actually very, very aggressively. And typically this would actually drop grip out of the car. However, obviously Senna was a very fast driver and he's making this work. Jonathan Palmer was a test driver at McLaren and he describes Senna's technique while they were driving together.
Although I spent 6 years racing against Ayrton in Formula One, it really wasn't until I joined McLaren as a test driver in 1990 that I had the chance to see exactly how fast he was and exactly how he did it. And normally I'd do the first day or two pounding around, getting down to what I thought was a very respectable time before Senna came along, and within 10 laps he would have been a second faster. So how did he do it? On acceleration out of the corner, Senna's unique technique is equally obvious. Whereas I would progressively increase the throttle opening, Ayrton would immediately start stabbing at it, pushing to get his foot hard down earlier, and therefore exit faster too. Putting both of these together means that with this example, he pulls out 0.2 of a second through this section alone, and that's just one small part of the whole lap.
This is something that we don't see very often. It's something that we don't see other drivers do. And it's really interesting to try and look into why Senna did this and how he could actually get away with such a strange, quite violent technique. So most drivers try to be super smooth on the accelerator as they're coming through and out of a corner. Now there are a couple of reasons for this. Firstly, we don't want to transfer too much weight around the car. Because the cars have suspension, when you brake, the nose of the car will dive and come down, and when you accelerate, the rear of the car will squat. So that means that you're moving weight around the car, and when you transfer more weight, you actually lower overall grip. If you're braking, the front is lower, it has more weight, the tyres are being literally pushed into the track harder. So if you're braking, the nose has lots of weight and lots of grip, but it actually takes it away from the rear of the car because the rear of the car is actually rising up, it doesn't have much weight in it. And so if you turn the car in at that period, the front would grip but the rear would slide around, and it works the same with the accelerator pedal on the flip side. So if you accelerate, you could actually drop the rear down, reduce the grip in the front of the car and cause the car to understeer prematurely. So you'll always hear driver coaches talking about being super smooth because we don't want to transfer too much weight around the car, causing it to break traction, to slide earlier than we really want. Secondly, the more aggressive you are with the accelerator, the more likely the car is to spin up the driven wheels and actually cause wheel spin. And as soon as you trigger wheel spin, you're not accelerating the car out the corner as quickly as you possibly can. So why did Senna drive this way with such an unusual technique? Well, many people say it was because of his days driving turbo cars. The idea being that you can spool up the turbo with a blip on the accelerator pedal to reduce the turbo lag. Basically, when you get on the accelerator, it spins the turbo up, which in turn forces air into the engine, meaning that you can add more fuel and produce more power. Obviously, when you're braking and going through a corner only on part throttle, the turbo won't be spinning quite as quickly and therefore you won't have as much power. Blipping the accelerator on the way into and through a corner keeps those exhaust gases moving, keeps the turbo spinning and keeps the engine in the peak power range. Now, Formula One cars in 1986 did indeed have turbos, and you can hear Senna blipping the accelerator from the mid corner to keep that turbo going in this following footage. And this indeed would make a difference to the power of the engine. There is a reason that Senna's doing this. But actually, Senna started doing this throttle blip style way before he ever got in a race car. He actually started doing it when he began karting. Now, in karts, you can sometimes get on the accelerator as you're braking and decelerating into a corner to try to reduce the rear axle locking up, as it's a solid axle running through the back of the go-kart. Also, karts don't have suspension and they don't have much power, so you won't get this weight transfer that you get in a car, and any blip on the accelerator will be dampened somewhat because, as mentioned, the karts don't have very much power. Another theory is that this was a technique that Senna picked up when he was a child, and it was a habit that formed within him. Driving on track is such a complex thing. It can be such a natural thing because there's so many things happening all at once that it's actually quite difficult to break even the most simple of habits that you've formed early in life. So it could well be that he developed this technique while he was in his formative years and then just made it work while he was in Formula One. Not only did Senna do this in karting, but it seems that he did it all the way through his kart racing career too. From 1989, Formula One cars were naturally aspirated. That means they didn't have turbos, and yet Senna still continued this blip throttle technique. I've now watched so much footage of Senna driving on board, and he continues to do this strange technique all the way through his career. So how could he possibly make a technique like this work? In my opinion, the reason that he could get away with doing this was that the blips were so short and so aggressive that the car didn't have time to react in terms of the suspension dropping down and the weight transferring around the chassis. If you look at this throttle tracer I found online, you can see how quick the throttle blips were and how frequent they were. In my opinion, the car wouldn't have time to react in this situation, and so the weight wasn't actually moving around too much. The difficulty is this would be an incredibly difficult thing to do consistently every corner, every lap. Obviously this is Ayrton Senna, and so he had the talent to make that work. So could a technique like this work in today's modern Formula One? Well, modern F1 cars have much more downforce than they did 30 years ago, and they generate that downforce in a slightly different way. If you think of the car as a platform, modern F1 cars have a lot of rake, which is the difference between the front and the rear ride height. And generally, the more rake that you add, the more aero downforce from the floor the car gets. The rake also defines the center of this downforce, the center of pressure, which ultimately dictates the balance of the car. So whether the front has more grip or the rear has more grip. So with Senna's technique, with the blip on the accelerator, the pitch of the car would be changing all the way through the corner, shifting the grip from the front to the rear, the front to the rear. So the car would be understeering, oversteering, understeering, oversteering, all the way through the mid corner. So could Senna have been even faster if he switched up his technique and changed to a more conventional driving style? Well, we'll never know, unfortunately, but a driver of Senna's caliber absolutely made this work for himself. You can compare the style somewhat to modern ABS systems, where when you brake and the tyre begins to slide across the surface of the tarmac, the ABS system will actually release the brakes a little bit to regain traction before it then applies the brakes once again. Senna did a style of this kind of system where he actually got on the accelerator until the rears broke traction, then lifted a little bit and then got back on. So we had this kind of blipping along, following the limit up as he exited a corner. But the thing is, if you compare braking where a driver is relying on an ABS system versus a driver who is doing threshold braking really well, the threshold braking, the smoother braking, actually will slow down a car much more quickly than ABS. If you enjoyed this, check out my video about Max Verstappen and why he's so fast in the wet. And if you're a track driver yourself, check out this short playlist that I've put together to make you faster on track.